In the fall of 1991, a hot and humid atmosphere enveloped a quiet residential area in Arkansas, where familiar roads and a steady rhythm of life rarely saw anything out of the ordinary. Robert Clay Whitfield's car left the house that evening just as it did every day, with no unusual goodbye, no sign that this would be the last time he was seen. Hours passed, then the night closed in with an inexplicable silence as Robert did not return, and the phone went unanswered. What began as a routine evening quickly turned into growing concern within the family, then into a missing person report forwarded to the local police. A search was launched along the routes in familiar areas Robert frequented, but it yielded only emptiness and unanswered questions. In the days that followed, every assumption was considered, yet none held firm long enough to guide the investigation. As time passed without new leads, the case gradually lost its initial urgency. Robert Clay Whitfield's file was recorded, updated, and quietly slipped deep into the archives with an ambiguous status: missing, cause undetermined. Those involved continued their lives, while the question of where Robert had gone remained. For years, the file lay dormant, as if time had frozen every possibility of uncovering the truth, until a review of old records and overlooked evidence forced the case back into the light. For some stories do not end when a person disappears, they only begin from that moment. Before diving deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys to uncover forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In the fall of 1991, a small town in Arkansas lay under its familiar calm atmosphere, where quiet roads, low rows of houses, and a slow pace of life created a sense of safety so complete that no one imagined a mysterious disappearance could happen right here. Robert Clay Whitfield had spent most of his adult life in this town, tied to stable habits and a daily routine that had barely changed over the years. The day he vanished began just like hundreds before it, with no noticeable unusual signs. In the morning, Robert left home at his usual time, carrying his everyday personal items, saying brief familiar goodbyes to his wife and daughter before heading out. No one in the family noted anything strange in his behavior or mood. Throughout that day, Robert appeared at several familiar locations, places he often visited, and those who saw him confirmed everything seemed normal. His last confirmed activity occurred in the late afternoon, when he left a regular stop and said he would be home around his usual time. After that point, Robert Clay Whitfield was never seen again. As the sky began to darken, Marilyn Sue Whitfield still felt no worry, since Robert occasionally came home late, though it was rare. She continued waiting in the quiet house, dinner kept warm, the living room light still on, and the wall clock slowly ticking away each minute. However, as the time passed the hour Robert had never missed before, initial reassurance began giving way to unease. Marilyn tried contacting her husband through available means, but received no response. The silence stretched from evening into night, then into the next morning, making the period of no contact impossible to explain with ordinary reasons. The family began searching for Robert on their own, hoping he had only encountered a minor issue delaying his return. Marilyn checked the entire house, garage, yard, and surrounding areas, while Lindsay Ann Whitfield called relatives, friends, and acquaintances who might have seen Robert that day. Each call ended with the same answer: no one knew where he was, no one had seen him after the last confirmed time. The family continued expanding their personal search, driving along roads Robert usually took and stopping at familiar places, in hopes of finding even the smallest sign that he had passed through. The town remained quiet, everything running as usual, but Robert's absence grew increasingly clear and heavy. There were no messages, no calls, no notes left behind, no sign that he had left voluntarily or met anyone after the last time. As each silent hour passed, the family's worry turned to fear, because Robert was a man of steady habits, rarely changing plans, and always notifying if something would make him late. By the time morning passed with no news, every personal search effort had been exhausted without result. The prolonged waiting exhausted the family, and the hope that Robert would simply show up grew faint. Deciding to call the police did not come as an immediate reflex, but as the result of hesitation, of wanting to delay the moment of admitting this disappearance was beyond their control. But as the next hours passed in absolute silence, Marilyn understood this was no longer a temporary absence or minor incident that could resolve itself. She picked up the phone, providing the most basic information about her husband, the last time he was seen, and the fact that Robert Clay Whitfield had vanished without any explanation. That moment closed the final stage in which the family still believed they could find answers themselves, and marked the beginning of a new reality, where Robert's disappearance was no longer just a quiet worry in the home, but an official event requiring documentation. Marilyn Sue Whitfield's call was received late in the morning, nearly a full day after Robert Clay Whitfield was last seen, and from the first minutes, it was handled as a routine missing person case, according to local administrative procedure. The dispatcher recorded basic information, including the missing person's full name, age, residence, the time the family determined contact was lost, and the initial personal search efforts already made. No immediate emergency was reported in the call, no information about specific threats, accidents, or violent behavior, so the case was classified as a missing person in the initial categorization. A police unit was dispatched to the Whitfield family residence to take information directly, with the goal of verifying the situation and completing necessary procedures. When police arrived at the house, there was no cordoning off or scene protection, as at that point no basis existed to indicate this was a criminal case. The home remained in its normal living state, with no clear signs of disturbance and no restrictions on movement or access. Officers spoke with Marilyn and Lindsay Ann Whitfield in the familiar family setting, recording their account of when Robert left home, his planned schedule for the day, and the period when the family began to feel something was wrong because he did not return. The case was classified as a missing person based on specific administrative criteria. Robert was an adult, with no reported history of mental disorder, no confirmed signs of intentional abandonment of home, but no clear danger indicators had appeared at the time of intake. The family was asked to provide detailed and systematic background information, including a description of Robert's appearance, height, estimated weight, hair color, eye color, usual clothing habits, personal items he typically carried when leaving, and any contact information that might help build the file. Marilyn provided additional context about her husband's daily routine, emphasizing that Robert rarely changed his schedule without prior notice, and that this prolonged silence was unprecedented. Lindsay added a list of acquaintances the family had contacted without gaining information, along with familiar places Robert often visited. All this data was carefully recorded, not for analysis or deduction, but to complete the initial file per regulations. Officers also asked about Robert's usual means of transportation, phone habits, and the possibility he might have left town briefly on his own, but these questions remained within the scope of gathering background information, without any conclusions or assumptions. The family was explained the process for handling a missing person case, including filing an official report, entering data into the system, and the possibility of follow-up if new information arose. Some necessary paperwork was completed right at the home, clearly stating the time the report was received, the identity of the reporting party, and their relationship to the missing person. No investigative actions were taken at this point, no examination of Robert's personal belongings, or requests to surrender any items, as everything was still considered an undetermined situation. After completing the initial administrative procedures, the police left the Whitfield residence, taking the newly created file and the responsibility to update the case per procedure. The house returned to its previous quiet state, but from that moment, Robert Clay Whitfield's disappearance was officially recorded in the system, not merely a private family concern, but a case requiring monitoring. The family was instructed that if any new information, even the smallest, came up, they should report it immediately for updating in the file, and that during this phase everything would proceed according to standard administrative sequence. There were no promises, no predictions, only regulations and procedures applied mechanically yet necessarily, marking the shift from desperate waiting to officially documented waiting, where Robert's disappearance was placed within the framework of the legal and public administrative system. Immediately after Robert Clay Whitfield's missing person file was created and entered into the system per standard administrative procedure, the case moved to the initial assessment phase at the department level, where information gathered from the family and preliminary field reports were reviewed systematically, but entirely within the scope of desk work. Detective Samuel R. Booker was assigned to handle the file, not because the case showed signs of particular seriousness, but because he was an experienced investigator in handling adult missing person cases in the area. This assignment was purely operational, to ensure consistent file tracking with one person primarily responsible for updates and evaluation. Booker approached the case by reviewing all recorded data, from the intake report to notes on family circumstances, daily habits, and Robert's personal background. An initial risk assessment was conducted based on objective criteria, commonly used in missing person cases, with Robert's age as a key factor. At 51, he did not fall into high-risk groups such as elderly individuals, living alone or those with severe medical histories, but neither was he in the younger group prone to free movement or sudden relocation. His stable daily habits, years-long repeating schedule, and long-term ties to the local community were seen as factors reducing the likelihood of voluntary departure without notice. However, these assessments were recorded only as risk indicators, not used to draw any conclusions or speculations about the cause of disappearance. Booker continued by verifying Robert's recent schedule based on family-provided information, organizing the timeline to identify the last reliably confirmed point of his presence. This was intended to clarify the gap from when Robert left his last confirmed activity until the family noticed something unusual, but it remained limited to systematizing data, without any field verification or tracing actions. Notes related to Robert's daily habits, including routines, frequently visited locations, and degree of schedule variation were compiled for future file tracking. In parallel, Booker verified Robert's direct relationships based on the family-provided list, including close relatives, friends, co-workers, and frequent contacts. Verification at this stage did not go beyond basic identity checks and cross-referencing with available administrative data to ensure these relationships were fully and accurately recorded. No interviews were conducted, no requests for statements or cross-checks of information, as the goal of this phase was only to complete the foundational picture of the missing person's social life. Booker also reviewed information related to Robert's financial situation, employment, and daily life at a general level, based on what the family presented, to determine if any elements required special note in the file. All these steps were carried out in the office environment, through documents, forms, and data systems, without direct intervention into the Whitfield family's life or property. A key point in the initial assessment was that no hypothesis had yet formed regarding the cause or circumstances of Robert's disappearance. Booker deliberately avoided labeling the case with familiar scenarios, because at this stage, no possibility had sufficient data for serious consideration. Keeping the file neutral was deemed essential to avoid misguided directions that could affect subsequent steps. Assessments of risk level, daily habits, and social relationships were noted only as reference factors, not as conclusions. When the initial assessment process was complete, Robert Clay Whitfield's file was updated with the systematized information, accompanied by a note that this was a missing person case involving an adult with a stable living background, with no clear signs of voluntary departure or immediate danger. Everything remained within the framework of desk analysis, where data was organized, checked and archived, awaiting further processing steps per operational sequence, while the case itself had not yet been placed into any specific direction, speculation, or scenario. From the initial assessments of the records and the systematized information, the field search operation was launched with a primary focus on directly surveying the physical spaces where Robert Clay Whitfield might have appeared after his last confirmed sighting. The search began in the areas closest to his everyday life, including the vicinity around his residence, the internal roads within the residential area, small pathways, vacant lots, and familiar public spaces that Robert frequently passed through in his daily routine. The search teams moved in an organized manner, dividing the area into smaller sections to ensure no easily obscured spots were overlooked, while maintaining visual observation for any unusual signs that might be related to Robert's presence. No control measures or cordons were implemented, as this was still considered a missing person search under undetermined circumstances, with the sole objective of locating the individual rather than collecting evidence. When the sweep of the immediate neighborhood yielded no results, the search radius was expanded along the anticipated routes Robert might have taken on the day he disappeared, based on his long-standing habits and the paths he commonly used. The search teams conducted checks along these routes, including both low-traffic sections and areas with higher traffic density, where the possibility of him stopping or encountering an incident was considered at a basic level. The expansion of the radius was carried out sequentially, from near to far, with the aim of progressively ruling out the simplest possibilities before accepting that Robert might have left his familiar area. In parallel, the main transportation routes connecting the town to neighboring areas were also surveyed, not for tracking or inference, but to observe any visible signs indicating that a person had stopped, changed direction, or left something unusual behind. Parking spots, temporary pull-offs, wide shoulders, and locations easily observable from the roadway were manually checked, relying on field experience and the observational skills of the search personnel. Throughout this process, no specialized equipment or advanced technology was used, as the search remained within the standard framework of an undetermined missing person case. Areas already checked were documented to avoid duplication, while search teams continuously exchanged information to adjust the scope in line with available resources. However, despite expanding the search area and sustaining efforts for a sufficient duration, no decisive signs were found. No personal items appeared, no vehicle was abandoned, and no clear traces indicated Robert's presence or any obstacle in the areas surveyed. The absence of clues did not provide answers, but it gradually eliminated simple possibilities such as him merely stopping temporarily near home or experiencing a minor issue along a familiar route. The search operation continued until all priority areas had been fully covered according to field logic, and further expansion of the radius no longer offered practical value commensurate with the resources expended. Search teams progressively concluded their tasks, compiling the areas checked and recording the negative findings, thereby establishing an important reality: within the scope of direct search actions feasible at this stage, Robert Clay Whitfield was not located. The active search phase concluded without a specific resolution, leaving only an emptiness of information and a long list of thoroughly checked locations that yielded no visible signs, reinforcing the realization that Robert's disappearance could not be explained by simple or easily observable scenarios in his familiar environment. The failure to find any visible signs of Robert Clay Whitfield within his familiar living area shifted the focus away from the spaces of his daily life. It was in this context that information emerged about a body discovered in a remote area, a separate event not directly linked to the prior search efforts, yet carrying decisive significance for the fate of the missing person. The body was found at a location far from residential areas, outside the usual routes of daily activity, in a sparsely traveled zone with almost no regular community presence. The surrounding space was characterized by isolation, with natural terrain sufficient to obscure visibility from a distance, allowing an unusual object to remain unnoticed for an extended period. The discovery occurred by chance when an individual passing through the area noticed something abnormal and decided to report it to the authorities, rather than as a direct result of an organized search campaign. Once the information reached the competent units, the responding force approached the discovery site with the immediate objective of confirming the body's condition and documenting the circumstances of the find in accordance with procedure. The surrounding area was cordoned off to the minimum extent necessary to limit disturbance, not for in-depth investigation or evidence collection, but to preserve the scene intact pending further steps. At the time of discovery, the body did not permit immediate visual identification due to environmental conditions and the state of the remains affected by the passage of time. Identity confirmation therefore relied not on a single factor, but on cross-referencing multiple basic characteristics, including body build, remaining clothing, and any identifiable features observable at the scene, compared against data from missing persons cases recorded in the area and neighboring localities. This verification process proceeded cautiously, step by step, until sufficient matching information converged to confirm that the discovered body was that of Robert Clay Whitfield. The confirmation of identity was a pivotal moment, not only because it ended the unresolved missing person status, but also because from that point onward, Robert's disappearance became tied to a concrete, tangible entity, rather than an informational void. A preliminary assessment of the body's condition was conducted at the discovery site to the extent necessary for further handling, focusing on directly observable factors without deep intervention. The condition of the body indicated that death did not occur in a normal living context, but at this stage, no conclusions were drawn regarding the cause or manner of death. Factors such as the body's position, posture, surrounding environment, and the degree of natural environmental impact were objectively recorded to accurately reflect the scene at the time of discovery, without any assumptions or inferences. After identity confirmation, information about the body was transmitted to the relevant authorities according to required procedure, including units responsible for handling remains, preparing reports, and coordinating subsequent steps. This notification was a mandatory administrative action to ensure the discovery event was fully recorded in the system and the necessary procedures activated. The Whitfield family was also informed of the confirmation results, a moment that closed the phase of waiting in faint hope that Robert might still be alive, while opening an irreversible reality. The discovery of the body in a remote area held not only personal significance for the family, but also compelled the case handling system to shift its approach. From that point, the case classification no longer fit a standard missing person scenario, as the presence of a body placed the matter in an entirely different status. The file was updated to reflect this change, recording that Robert Clay Whitfield had been found deceased, with circumstances yet to be clarified at the time of discovery. The reclassification did not carry any conclusions or accusations, nor did it imply the nature of the event, but it marked a clear boundary between two distinct handling phases of the same case. The discovery of the body, confirmation of the victim's identity, preliminary assessment of condition, and notification to relevant authorities fully concluded the missing person search phase, leaving a new reality, where Robert Clay Whitfield's absence was no longer an open question of location but a confirmed event, laying the foundation for subsequent handling within the appropriate framework for an unresolved death case. The discovery and identification of Robert Clay Whitfield's body shifted subsequent procedures to the forensic phase in accordance with mandatory protocol, with the autopsy becoming the central step to document the body's condition and establish the most objective information possible about his death. The body was transported from the discovery site to an appropriate facility for examination under controlled conditions, ensuring the state of the remains was preserved to the maximum extent possible compared to the time of discovery. The autopsy was conducted by forensic experts following standard procedure, beginning with an overall recording of the body's external condition, including the degree of decomposition, skin state, remaining clothing, and any signs observable to the naked eye. All steps were carried out systematically, with the sole objective of documenting the current state, rather than seeking or proving any specific hypothesis. During the process, the experts noted that the condition of the body did not allow for an immediate and clear determination of the cause of death. Environmental and temporal changes had obscured many key physiological signs, rendering commonly used indicators unreliable when considered in isolation. The inability to precisely determine the cause of death at the initial autopsy was recorded as a professional conclusion, reflecting the objective limitations of what could be gathered from the body's condition. In parallel, the autopsy also documented the presence of certain signs indicating external intervention on Robert's body before or at the time of death. These signs were neither interpreted nor speculated upon regarding their origin. They were described neutrally, including abnormal changes to the body inconsistent with common natural causes. Recording these signs of external intervention did not equate to identifying their nature, but served only to reflect the reality that Robert's death could not be considered an obvious result of known natural pathology or routine accident based on the observations. Estimation of time of death was based on a synthesis of available forensic factors, including decomposition state, environmental conditions at the discovery site, and any remaining accessible biological indicators. However, like the cause of death, this estimate could only provide a relatively wide time range, insufficiently precise to pinpoint a specific moment. The time of death range was recorded as such, reflecting the inherent uncertainty of evaluation under conditions where the body had been subjected to environmental effects for an undetermined period. All findings from the autopsy were carefully documented step by step, observation by observation, limitation by limitation, to ensure the forensic report truthfully reflected what had been confirmed as well as what could not be confirmed at that time. The forensic report was prepared as an independent document, separate from any speculation or case-handling direction, focusing on describing the body's condition, objective findings, and professional conclusions within permissible limits. The report did not provide a final conclusion on the cause of death, but emphasized that the cause could not be definitively determined based on the available data. At the same time, it clearly recorded the existence of signs of external intervention, along with their degree and nature that could not yet be clarified, as part of the official forensic record. Completion of the forensic report closed the autopsy phase with an incomplete outcome in terms of answers, but full in terms of procedure, as everything that could be recorded had been recorded, and all limitations of the assessment were explicitly stated. From an administrative and professional standpoint, the forensic report became a key document establishing that Robert Clay Whitfield's death could not be simply explained by known natural causes, yet there was insufficient data to precisely determine what had occurred. This phase ended in a state of informational suspension, where death was confirmed, but the manner and circumstances leading to it remained beyond the forensic capacity to conclude at that time, leaving a significant gap between what had been documented and what could not yet be clarified. The limited conclusions from the forensic report forced the focus of the case handling to return to the spaces connected to Robert Clay Whitfield's life before his disappearance, and in that context, his residence became the first location to undergo a proper crime scene investigation procedure. The residential area was cordoned off to the necessary extent to allow authorities to access and process it without further disturbing any remaining physical elements, with the goal of documenting the state of the living space as close as possible to the time before Robert went missing. The cordoning was not excessively broad or urgent, as there were no signs indicating this was a scene of overt violence. It was carried out to ensure the integrity of the documentation and collection process. The rooms in the house were examined one by one, from shared living areas to private spaces, with particular attention to the arrangement, condition of items, and any signs of unusual disruption compared to his everyday routine. During this process, authorities collected several physical items of evidence directly related to reconstructing the final hours before Robert disappeared, including personal belongings, documents, and items identified as potentially carrying informational value. The collection was done according to a catalog, with each piece of evidence recorded for its location, condition, and circumstances of discovery, to ensure the connection between the evidence and its original space was not lost during handling. These items were not considered proof of a specific criminal act at the time of collection, but were regarded as physical data necessary for later comparison and analysis. In parallel with evidence collection, the process of documenting unusual traces in the living space was carried out systematically. Minor changes in routine order, objects not in their usual places, or details inconsistent with the habits previously described by the family, were all noted without assigning them meaning beyond what could be directly observed. This documentation was not intended to build a scenario or hypothesis about what happened, but to create a neutral picture of the resident's condition at the time it was processed as a crime scene. The recorded traces included both elements that could stem from normal living and those that could not be immediately explained, all entered into the file with the necessary level of detail to serve future evaluations. Throughout the investigation of the resident's crime scene, authorities did not discover any decisive signs that could directly lead to identifying a specific individual involved in Robert's death. No evidence at that time allowed confirmation of another person's presence in the space at the critical time, nor were there clear physical traces indicating an act of violence at the residence. The lack of sufficient basis to identify a perpetrator was not seen as a failure of this phase, but accurately reflected the reality that what remained at the scene lacked clear indicators. The results of the crime scene investigation were therefore recorded as an incomplete set of data, in which each piece of evidence and each trace existed as an independent piece of information, not yet connectable into a complete picture. This phase concluded with the completion of crime scene processing procedures, sealing and storage of evidence according to regulations, and updating the case file to reflect that although the residence of Robert Clay Whitfield had been fully cordoned off, collected and documented, it did not provide sufficient grounds to determine who caused his death or exactly what happened in that space. The data collected from the resident's crime scene, combined with the forensic report that did not specify a cause of death, forced the responsible units to enter a phase of comprehensive evaluation of the entire case handling process from the time Robert Clay Whitfield disappeared until his body was discovered. This evaluation did not focus on expanding new investigative directions, but on systematically reviewing everything that had been done, from background information provided by the family, field search activities, autopsy results, to findings from the resident's crime scene processing. Each group of data was examined in relation to the others to determine whether any unexploited intersections existed or whether any detail had been overlooked in the initial handling. The comprehensive evaluation was conducted cautiously, with clear awareness that investigative resources were not unlimited and needed to be allocated based on the potential to generate new results. Through the review process, no investigative direction emerged as a viable path to pursue at that time, as all available data had been processed within the limits of the information and technology available. No new leads appeared that could open a different approach, nor was there any additional information from witnesses, evidence or external data sources capable of changing the overall picture of the case. The absence of new leads was not the result of stopping the search for information, but the consequence of all information channels having been exploited to the maximum extent under the conditions at the time. Faced with that reality, the decision to reclassify the case file as a cold case was made as a necessary administrative step, accurately reflecting the case's status rather than an abandonment of effort. This reclassification did not mean the case was permanently closed, but established that at the present time, there was no realistic basis to continue active investigative activities without new information. Robert Clay Whitfield's file was reclassified in the system, marked as an unresolved case with key details still pending and unable to progress further without the emergence of new factors. Along with that decision, the storage of evidence and documents became a crucial part of the transition to cold case status. All evidence collected in previous phases, though not decisive at the time of collection, was sealed, coded, and stored according to regulations to ensure long-term integrity. The case file documents, including incident reports, search reports, forensic examination results, crime scene documentation, and comprehensive evaluations were organized and stored systematically for potential future retrieval if needed. Storage was not merely preservation but also preparation for the possibility that the case might be revisited when conditions allowed. Cold case status placed Robert's case in a different temporal space, where progress was no longer measured in days or weeks, but in indefinite periods of silence. This decision marked the end of the active investigation phase and opened a passive waiting phase, in which the file existed as an incomplete set of information, ready to be reactivated if a new factor emerged. The official classification of the case as a cold case reflected the harsh reality of investigative work, where not every death can be resolved immediately, and some questions must be set aside until time, technology, or some unexpected event provides a new opportunity to seek answers. When Robert Clay Whitfield's file was officially reclassified as a cold case, the entire matter entered a prolonged passive existence phase, where all handling activities were no longer proactive or continuous, but maintained only at the minimum administrative level required. The file was no longer assigned to a dedicated investigator, nor was it on any list of cases requiring regular monitoring. Instead, it was placed in the general archive alongside other stalled cases. In that context, the case no longer appeared in operational assignment meetings, was not mentioned in progress reports, and was not included in any investigative unit's processing plans. At this point, the file's existence was purely formal, maintained to ensure legal continuity rather than reflecting an active process. No in-depth periodic reviews of the case content were conducted, as all approaches had been assessed as unlikely to produce new results under the information and technology conditions at the time. Throughout this phase, no new data directly related to Robert Clay Whitfield's death emerged. There were no additional reports from the public, no information forwarded from other law enforcement agencies, and no matches when cross-referencing the file with other cases in the area or beyond. The system recorded no signals indicating the case could be reactivated, leaving the file unchanged year after year. The evidence collected in earlier phases continued to be preserved according to procedure, sealed, coded, and stored in the evidence warehouse under controlled environmental conditions to ensure long-term integrity. Evidence preservation was carried out mechanically through periodic inventory checks to confirm that items remained intact, undamaged, lost, or tampered with. However, these items were not subjected to further analysis or re-examination by any method, as there was no administrative or professional basis to do so without new leads. The case file documents existed in a similar state, with all reports, minutes and interim conclusions kept exactly as they were at the time of reclassification to cold case status. No edits, additions, or updates were made to the file's content. Whenever the file was accessed, if at all, it was only for statistical or administrative verification purposes, not to reopen the investigative process. Over time, Robert Clay Whitfield's case gradually became one of many unresolved files existing in parallel within the system, neither prominent nor erased, but also not mentioned. Time in this phase was not measured by milestones or events, but by the prolonged repetition of a non-progressive state, where each passing year brought no change to the case's handling status. The unanswered questions in the file were not further clarified, but were also not closed by any new conclusions. The case existed as a fixed set of information, accurately reflecting what was known while clearly exposing what could not yet be known. The passage of time did not generate additional data, it only widened the gap between the moment Robert disappeared and the present, making the initial context of the case increasingly distant. Details once considered close to real life gradually became historical information, no longer tied to the daily operations of the authorities. In that state, the case was not considered closed, but it was also no longer part of the active flow of the investigative system. It existed as a waiting file, fully preserved but unexploited, awaiting an external factor, as yet unpredictable, capable of breaking the prolonged silence and forcing the system to return to what had been frozen throughout the passage of time. The prolonged existence of the Robert Clay Whitfield case in a state of dormancy began to change only when a systematic review of old cold cases was initiated as part of an internal process to reassess unresolved files from the past. This review was not triggered by any specific lead related to Robert, but arose from the overall need of the authorities to re-examine backlogged cases, cross-reference them with updated capabilities, storage methods, and evaluation criteria that had evolved over time. During the review, cold case files were removed from passive storage status to reassess the completeness of data, the condition of physical evidence, and the feasibility of re-accessing them under current conditions, even though no new information was introduced at this stage. The Robert Clay Whitfield file was examined in this context as a case that fully met the basic criteria for inclusion in a more in-depth evaluation list, as it had clear forensic documentation, intact preserved evidence, and no legal barriers that would make reprocessing impossible. The determination that the case qualified for reopening was not based on an assumption that answers could be quickly found, but on the assessment that the file had never been approached using more modern analytical methods and that the existing data still held value if systematically re-examined. This process involved multiple internal evaluation steps, in which each component of the file was compared against established reopening criteria, including the integrity of evidence, the level of detail in archived documents, and the ability to resequence events based on available data. Once the Robert file met these criteria, a proposal to reopen the case was drafted as a necessary administrative step, reflecting that the case qualified to return to active processing status, even though no specific direction for the process had yet been determined. The reopening proposal was forwarded through the appropriate approval levels, with the evaluation focusing not only on the case itself, but also on the impact of the decision on the unit's overall resource allocation. The approval to reopen the file was not granted hastily, as it meant reactivating a case that had been dormant for many years, entailing responsibilities for processing, monitoring, and reporting over an indefinite period. After the competent authorities fully reviewed the proposal and agreed that the Robert Clay Whitfield case deserved to be removed from cold case status, the decision to approve reopening was issued as an official administrative document, marking a fundamental change in the case's processing status. This decision did not imply that new leads had emerged, but established that from that point forward, the file was no longer confined to passive storage and was permitted to return to active investigative procedures. Along with the approval decision, new personnel were assigned to ensure the case was approached from a fresh perspective, unbound by the assumptions or tentative conclusions of the prior processing phase. The assigned investigators were not those who had directly handled the case in its initial phase, to avoid repeating old patterns of thinking and to allow for an independent reassessment of the file. The assignment of new personnel also reflected a shift in approach, treating the case no longer as a file depleted of exploitable potential, but as a dataset to be reread from the beginning, with the same level of care as a new case. Thus, the decision to reopen the file became a significant transitional milestone, not because it provided answers, but because it broke the prolonged state of inactivity, bringing Robert Clay Whitfield back to the center of an official processing procedure, where all old data was permitted to be re-examined in the light of the present. The approval to reopen the Robert Clay Whitfield case triggered a mandatory requirement to re-establish the entire physical data foundation of the case, with the evidence inventory serving as the first and most critical step before any analysis or re-investigation could proceed. All evidence related to the case, which had been stored for a long time under cold case status, was removed from passive storage for systematic inspection. The process began by cross-referencing the current evidence catalog with the original archived records to confirm the quantity, type, and sealing condition of each item. Each storage box was opened according to proper procedures, with full documentation of the external physical condition, signs of wear, environmental storage effects, and the integrity of the seals. Evidence was handled item by item, without combining or abbreviating, to ensure no detail was overlooked during the inventory. After confirming physical existence, the inventory proceeded to evaluate the preservation condition of each item, including the potential for quality degradation over time and compliance with current preservation standards. Evidence stored for an extended period was thoroughly examined for effects from temperature, humidity, light, or other environmental factors that could have altered material properties. This evaluation was not intended to immediately determine investigative value, but to establish an accurate picture of the actual condition of the physical data the case possessed after years of non-exploitation. Alongside assessing storage condition, experts evaluated the retestability of each item based on current scientific and technical criteria. Evidence that had been collected but only processed with limited methods during the initial investigation was re-examined to determine whether it could yield new information if subjected to more advanced analytical techniques. The retestability assessment was not speculative but grounded in specific factors such as material nature, potential retention of biological or physical traces, degree of degradation due to time, and the ability to isolate valuable data from sources of error. During this process, each item was categorized by potential level from samples capable of providing new data, to those with limited value, and finally to those deemed no longer suitable for any current analytical method. Evidence deemed no longer usable was placed on a list for exclusion from re-investigation scope. Exclusion was not performed simplistically or arbitrarily, but through a multi-step evaluation process, with detailed minutes stating the reason for exclusion, the item's condition, and the scientific basis for the decision. Each exclusion decision was approved by the appropriate authority to ensure no potential data was dismissed without due consideration. This exclusion reflected the reality that not all evidence retains its value over time, and part of re-investigation involves accepting the limits of what can be extracted from remaining physical data. After completing the screening, the focus of the inventory shifted to selecting priority samples for subsequent processing steps. Priority selection was based on combined criteria, including physical condition still permitting analysis, potential to contain unexploited data, and relevance to existing information gaps in the case file. Selected samples were not necessarily the most prominent items from the initial investigation, but could include items previously considered secondary that were now re-evaluated in light of modern analytical methods. Each priority sample was documented separately, recording its origin, storage history, current condition, selection rationale, and possible limitations during testing. This priority list was not conclusive but served as a physical data map, clearly identifying what the case could access during re-investigation. The entire evidence inventory process was conducted within strict administrative and scientific protocols, with the goal not to find immediate answers, but to re-establish a truthful and controlled data foundation. Upon completion of the inventory, the Robert Clay Whitfield file no longer existed as an unclassified collection of evidence, but became a comprehensively re-evaluated physical data structure, where each item had a clearly defined position, status, and usable value, laying the necessary foundation for subsequent analysis and processing steps in the re-investigation process. The completion of the inventory and priority sample selection enabled the re-investigation process to move into a phase of in-depth scientific processing, with DNA analysis implemented as a pivotal step to maximize the informational value remaining in the preserved biological evidence. The selected samples were not immediately subjected to analysis. First, they underwent a pre-processing evaluation to determine the feasibility of extracting genetic material after prolonged storage. Each biological sample was checked for physical condition, degree of degradation, risk of cross-contamination, and the potential to recover DNA of sufficient quality for analysis. This process was conducted cautiously to avoid using samples no longer of adequate quality, which could produce unstable data or lead to erroneous results. Once samples meeting minimum criteria were confirmed, the official DNA extraction procedure was carried out in a strictly controlled environment, with each step meticulously documented to ensure traceability and re-verification if needed. Extraction was not aimed at obtaining large quantities of DNA, but focused on recovering the maximum amount of intact DNA segments, accepting that the evidence, having endured a long time, might have fragmented and significantly degraded genetic material. After extraction was completed, the resulting DNA samples were evaluated for quality and amplifiability, thereby determining the most suitable analysis method for each specific sample. The chosen analytical technologies were applied carefully, based on methods proven effective at the time of reinvestigation, avoiding techniques beyond practical capability or not yet standardized. These methods allowed amplification of remaining short DNA fragments, enabling the construction of genetic profiles even when samples were not in ideal condition. The entire analysis process adhered to rigorous quality control protocols, including control checks to eliminate cross-contamination risks and ensure the data accurately reflected the sample's origin. Once a DNA profile was generated, technical parameters were assessed to determine the completeness and reliability of the data, deciding whether the profile qualified for database comparison. Profiles failing to meet the threshold were excluded from the next phase to avoid introducing unstable data into the system. For profiles meeting standards, the comparison step was implemented in sequence, with data entered into the system and compared against existing profiles without any assumptions about the outcome. The comparison occurred in the awareness that most DNA analyses in cold cases do not yield matches, and that a non-match is a common result. However, in this instance, the comparison system recorded the emergence of a potential match, as the DNA profile obtained from the evidence showed significant similarity to a previously stored profile. This result was not treated as conclusive evidence, but handled as a data signal requiring further verification and confirmation. Upon detection of the potential match, an internal verification protocol was activated to ensure the result was not due to technical error, extraction mishandling, or comparison system mistake. Analytical parameters were re-reviewed, raw data independently checked, and processing steps cross-referenced with standard procedures to rule out discrepancies. Only when these confirmation steps confirmed the result's necessary reliability was the match officially recorded as a valid analytical outcome in the case file. The emergence of a potential match was documented in a detailed technical report describing the entire process from extraction, analysis, comparison, to result confirmation, along with the inherent limitations and uncertainties of DNA data obtained from old evidence. The report emphasized that a DNA match does not itself explain the relationship between the involved individual and the case, nor does it provide information about the context or timing of the DNA deposition. Nonetheless, within the framework of reinvestigation, the appearance of a potential match marked the first time in many years that the Robert Clay Whitfield file had acquired a new data element worthy of serious consideration. The DNA analysis phase concluded by establishing a new scientific foundation for the case, where genetic data became a component that could continue to be exploited in subsequent processing steps, although the practical significance of the match still required clarification through additional procedures beyond the scope of this phase. The DNA analysis results showing a potential match created a new database sufficient to move the reinvestigation process into the phase of narrowing down subjects, where the focus shifted from broadly reviewing records to identifying specific individuals with data connections to the physical evidence in the Robert Clay Whitfield case. Narrowing was conducted in a controlled manner, based on the principle that a DNA match does not automatically establish criminal liability, but serves only as a starting point for verifying the identity and degree of involvement of the individual indicated by genetic data. The list of potential subjects was built from the comparison results, with records failing reliability criteria or presenting a possibility of random coincidence excluded from the outset to avoid unnecessary expansion of scope. Through this screening process, One name emerged as requiring deeper verification: Jonathan Mark Kessler, an individual whose DNA profile showed a level of correspondence consistent with the potential match recorded during the analysis phase. Verification of Jonathan Mark Kessler was carried out according to strict administrative and operational procedures, beginning with confirmation of basic identity, current legal status, and demographic information to ensure the person under consideration was indeed the one indicated by the data system. Relevant databases were queried to confirm that the compared DNA profile belonged to Jonathan Mark Kessler and was not confused with another individual with similar information. Once identity was confirmed at the administrative level, focus shifted to examining Kessler's background and history to assess the overall context of this individual in relation to the case. Background checks were not aimed at seeking incriminating evidence, but at constructing a neutral picture of personal history, including places of residence over time, movements, documented social relationships, and any recorded legal history in the system. This information was collected from official data sources, ensuring all details could be independently traced and verified. The review of Jonathan Mark Kessler's past also included aligning key timelines in his life with the period of Robert Clay Whitfield's disappearance and discovery of death, to determine whether there was any spatial or temporal overlap. This alignment was done cautiously, without drawing conclusions beyond what the data allowed, and only recorded the degree of match or non-match as an initial evaluative factor. During the examination, information related to Kessler's occupation, daily activities, and travel history was reviewed to determine whether he had possible access to Robert Clay Whitfield during the relevant period, but all assessments remained descriptive, without inferring motive or behavior. After personal and historical data were compiled, the next step was to evaluate Jonathan Mark Kessler's degree of relevance to the case based on what had been verified. This evaluation was not intended to establish guilt, but to determine whether this individual had sufficient relevant factors to be considered a suspect within the reinvestigation framework. Evaluation criteria included the strength of the DNA match, overlap in time and space, and the presence of any elements in Kessler's past that could place him within the scope of the case. The assessment was conducted cautiously, with the understanding that a DNA match is only one piece in the overall data puzzle, and that identifying a suspect does not equate to identifying the perpetrator. The outcome of this phase was that Jonathan Mark Kessler was identified as an individual requiring continued review within the reinvestigation framework, based on the convergence of genetic data and verified background factors. This identification was recorded in the file as an organizational data advancement, marking the first time the Robert Clay Whitfield case had a specific individual under consideration based on scientific data, while simultaneously emphasizing that any conclusions regarding this individual's role or responsibility remained outside the scope of the current phase and required clarification through subsequent steps. The identification of Jonathan Mark Kessler as a potential suspect based on genetic data necessitated reopening the entire Robert Clay Whitfield case file for a systematic review of all old leads collected during the initial investigation and subsequent years, with the goal of reassessing their value in light of current data. The review did not begin by seeking new information, but by reassembling all recorded correspondence, calls, and forms of communication, including those previously classified as lacking investigative value or unverified at the time. Records of calls to the tip line, anonymous letters sent to authorities, notes on indirect contacts through third parties, and other scattered reports were extracted from archived files and strictly organized in chronological order. This arrangement aimed to create a continuous information flow, enabling reassessment of the frequency, timing, and context of each lead in relation to the overall case progression, rather than treating them as unrelated isolated details. Alongside the review of communications, key case timelines were re-examined in detail, including the last sighting of Robert Clay Whitfield, the period of lost contact, estimated time of death, time of body discovery, and relevant administrative milestones in file processing. These milestones were placed on a unified timeline to clearly identify gaps, overlaps, or potential inconsistencies that had not been fully recognized earlier due to scattered data. Timeline alignment was not intended to generate new hypotheses, but to ensure all data were evaluated within the same temporal frame, avoiding distorted assessments due to lack of context. Once the timeline was established, old leads began to be systematically linked to Jonathan Mark Kessler's profile. Recorded calls were cross-referenced with periods when Kessler was confirmed to be in the area or had potential access to Robert to determine whether any notable temporal coincidences existed. Anonymous letters were re-examined for content, sending time, and receipt context to assess whether they could reasonably be linked to specific phases in Kessler's life or travel history. This data linking was done cautiously, with the principle that any coincidence was recorded only as a reference factor, not interpreted as evidence or conclusive indication. During the review, many leads previously in the file were clearly identified as noise when viewed in the current data context. These included calls with unverifiable origins, speculative personal information, internally contradictory details, or details inconsistent with any confirmed timeline. Eliminating noise did not mean deleting data from the file, but reclassifying it as information no longer of analytical value, minimizing the risk of irrelevant details distorting overall evaluation. Leads removed from primary analysis scope remained fully archived, but were no longer used as a basis for cross-referencing or linking to the suspect. Alongside noise elimination, old leads that retained consistency in timing, content, and context were retained in the group of data requiring continued monitoring. This group was not large in number but shared the characteristic of fitting the case timeline without contradiction and not being excluded when cross-referenced with Kessler's profile. Thus, the review of old leads did not yield an immediate breakthrough, but served as a process of data cleansing and restructuring, in which previously fragmented information was reorganized into a more unified logic. When this phase concluded, the Robert Clay Whitfield case file was no longer a collection of overlapping and hard-to-manage leads, but a streamlined data structure, with remaining leads properly positioned in temporal context and relation to the suspect, creating a clearer foundation for subsequent evaluation without exceeding the scope of this review phase. The clean data block from the old leads review phase enabled the re-investigation team to move to supplemental investigation in a more direct manner, focusing on re-interviewing witnesses and testing the durability of statements over time rather than expanding the case into new directions. The witness list was rebuilt from the original file, divided into clear groups to avoid duplication and omission. Individuals who had contact with Robert Clay Whitfield in the period immediately before his disappearance. Those who provided information via phone or mail in the early phase. Those recorded by police as interviewed, but without full documentation. And those who appeared only indirectly in other statements. For each witness, contact information was verified and updated with current administrative data, as many had changed addresses, phone numbers, or residency status over the years. Recontact efforts were documented as a required operational step, including number of attempts, method of contact, response outcome, and reasons for inability to reach if applicable, ensuring that unable to interview also became a clear file entry rather than a vague gap. Re-interviews were standardized under the principle of stick to the file, do not lead, do not suggest. Investigators used old statements as a reference framework, but asked questions in neutral sequence to assess how witnesses spontaneously recalled events, then compared those to previously recorded details. For witnesses with previously sketchy or time-lacking statements, re-interviews prioritized clarifying the minimum structure of information, where they met Robert, under what circumstances, approximate time period, who was present, and what they relied on to recall that time frame. For those who had provided information by phone or mail, re-interviews focused on verifying whether they were the actual source or merely relaying information, while clarifying whether their source was direct or hearsay. All new data arising from re-interviews were not treated as new developments in the sense of opening new investigative paths, but recorded as updated versions of old data for comparison purposes. The second core focus of supplemental investigation was systematic cross-referencing of old statements rather than scattered rereading. Statements were placed on the standardized timeline established in the prior phase, then tabulated by theme: last sighting of Robert, daily routines, familiar stops, communication habits, minor daily events, descriptions of clothing and condition to check consistency across witnesses and stability of each witness's account over time. Minor discrepancies were classified as natural variations if they did not alter core content and could be explained by memory limitations, while discrepancies directly affecting time, location, or presence of others were classified as functional contradictions due to potential impact on establishing event sequence. For functional contradictions, verification was conducted minimally. No attempt to force statements to align, but rather determination of the source of the contradiction and its degree of impact. If a contradiction stemmed from misremembered order of days or confusion between similar events, it was clearly noted in the file along with the statement's reliability range. If a witness completely changed a key detail from the original record, investigators noted the change, requested the witness describe the basis of their memory, and flagged that portion of the statement for cautious use. Verification of contradictions also included cross-referencing statements with available administrative documents in the case file, such as initial report receipts, search team time notes, forensic record milestones, and previously established data. The goal was to determine whether contradictions could be explained by initial recording errors or reflected genuine instability in the information source. Throughout this phase, the re-investigation team maintained the principle of no hypothesis formed yet. All differences were recorded only as data, not interpreted as motive or scenario. Once re-interviews were completed according to priority list, the case file was updated into a unified structure to avoid the old overlapping documentation. Each witness had a dedicated section including identification information, contact history, summary of original statement, summary of new statement, comparison table of matches and differences, assessment of consistency and reliability range, and notes on contradictions verified or yet to be verified within supplemental investigation scope. Simultaneously, the case timeline section was updated to reflect reinforced milestones, or those with high uncertainty, ensuring that any subsequent steps, if needed, would rely on a standardized file rather than fragmented, hard-to-manage records. At the conclusion of the supplemental investigation phase, the Robert Clay Whitfield case did not naturally gain new answers, simply from re-interviewing, but the file became more professionally rigorous. The reliability level of each information source was clearly documented, contradictions were pinpointed, and genuine gaps were distinguished from those caused by inconsistent recording. This was the proper functional outcome of supplemental investigation, not to produce conclusions beyond scope, but to make human-sourced data in the file clean and reliable enough for responsible use within the re-investigation framework, preventing vague or unidentified contradictory details from skewing any evaluation of the relevance of individuals already identified in the file. The convergence of data from the prior screening phase to a sufficient level of reliability prompted the investigative team to shift to a phase of work requiring far greater patience and discipline, where every action had to occur in absolute silence and adhere strictly to the legal framework. The objective of this phase was not to produce an immediate breakthrough, but to accumulate a long sequence of observations solid enough to support subsequent steps. The suspect was placed under covert surveillance through passive monitoring measures, focusing on daily routines such as the time of leaving the residence in the morning, returning in the late afternoon or evening, habits of stopping at familiar locations, the stability of the weekly schedule, and differences between weekdays and weekends, all recorded with specific timestamps and without speculation, to establish a baseline behavioral pattern for future comparison. Surveillance was conducted in rotating shifts to avoid recognizable repetition, using unmarked vehicles and rotating personnel, maintaining a safe observation distance, minimizing direct face-to-face contact, while ensuring a sufficiently wide field of view to capture even the smallest changes in routine. Simultaneously, the suspect's primary travel routes were confirmed by cross-referencing multiple consecutive days, from the commute to work, commonly used turns, short-term stops, to low-traffic road segments, with each route mapped and analyzed for consistency and stability over time. A consistent route held entirely different value compared to sudden changes unrelated to clear daily needs. The team also noted occasional stops such as gas stations, convenience stores, public parking lots, or communal areas, not to determine specific purposes, but to assess consistency in the use of public spaces. Throughout, all social interactions were observed from a distance, including the frequency of exchanges with neighbors, co-workers, or acquaintances, the suspect's reaction to strangers approaching, the level of attention paid to the surrounding environment, and whether eye contact was maintained or avoided. When placed in a long-term sequence, these elements could reflect behavioral and emotional control. However, the team adhered to the principle of not assigning psychological meaning to individual gestures. All observations were described as observable and measurable actions, avoiding evaluative terms, such as anxious, tense, or uneasy, unless supported by strong data. In parallel with direct surveillance, administrative records related to the suspect continued to be cross-checked for consistency between current and historical data, including changes of residence over the years, vehicle registration history, employment records, past periods of interruption, and previously noted but unverified connections, the goal being to eliminate any information gaps that could affect behavioral assessment. Surveillance data was categorized into groups such as personal routines, movement, social interactions, and environmental responses, then compiled into independent daily tracking tables, allowing the analytical team to conduct periodic reviews to detect recurring patterns or significant deviations, such as unexplained schedule changes, newly appearing then disappearing routes, or sudden increases in avoidance of public spaces. Throughout this phase, information control was paramount. Only essential personnel had access to the full dataset to minimize leak risks and ensure the suspect showed no signs of detecting surveillance. Once the observation sequence was sufficiently long, the team conducted a comprehensive assessment of behavioral stability, focusing on the ability to maintain consistent habits over weeks, the compatibility between current routines and the social image the suspect projected, and the absence of impulsive behaviors that might reveal internal pressure. Though these assessments remained internal analysis and were not yet formalized into conclusions. Another critical aspect of surveillance was identifying everyday situations that could naturally and legally produce biological traces, such as using disposable items in public, disposing of personal waste, or touching shared surfaces. All potential scenarios were discussed in advance, at the procedural level, to ensure that if an opportunity arose, collection would follow proper sealing and preservation protocols without violating privacy or exceeding authority. Before shifting focus to sample collection preparation, the team conducted a final review of all surveillance data to check for any signs that the suspect had altered behavior toward avoidance, heightened alertness, or abnormal routine adjustments, as even one indication of awareness could compromise the value of observations and the naturalness of future biological samples. The entire surveillance phase was documented in detail as a standalone section in the reinvestigation file, with clear structure, specific timestamps, and identified data sources to ensure every step could be verified later, while providing a solid foundation for transitioning to subsequent operational activities, without disrupting the continuity of the painstakingly built investigative process across prior phases. With the case file strengthened by witness statements and human data structure, an important but sensitive step emerged: indirect collection of biological samples for DNA comparison, a move carefully considered to ensure compliance with the legal and technological context at the time of reinvestigation. Rather than directly approaching the subject to request a sample, the investigative team opted for indirect collection from everyday items capable of retaining biological traces used by the subject in daily life, an approach that minimized legal risks and allowed preliminary assessment of sample suitability before proceeding further. The identification of potential sample sources was conducted meticulously, based on updated administrative data, including current residents, public routine habits, frequently visited locations, and legal accessibility by authorities to those spaces. Each potential collection opportunity was analyzed for legality, risk of cross-contamination, and potential biological trace value to avoid indiscriminate collection that could waste resources or yield substandard samples. Once a suitable source was identified, a written collection plan was prepared, detailing the location, timing, type of item to be collected, collection method, participating personnel, and sealing preservation procedures to ensure every step could be traced and verified if necessary. Collection operations were carried out discreetly, without drawing attention or directly interfering with the subject's personal life, while adhering to the principle of not invading private spaces beyond permitted limits. Items identified as capable of bearing biological traces, such as used personal items or objects in direct contact with mouth, hands, or skin, were collected using specialized tools to avoid loss or contamination of traces. At the collection site, each item was placed in a separate container, labeled with encoded identifiers recording time, location, collector, and environmental conditions, to ensure an unbroken chain of custody. Sealing followed standardized procedures. Containers were sealed shut, secured with numbered specialized seals, signed by the responsible person, and recorded in a collection report. All steps were meticulously documented in the case file to ensure no gaps in the chain of custody, an especially critical factor in cases spanning many years where the integrity of evidence is frequently questioned. After collection, items were stored under conditions appropriate to the expected biological sample type, including temperature and humidity control and avoidance of direct light to minimize DNA degradation prior to testing. Transport to the laboratory followed a predetermined route, with detailed handover records between participating units, from investigative personnel to the lab, each transfer documented by signed minutes. At the laboratory, samples were received and the seal condition checked before opening. Any anomalies were separately documented to assess potential impact on testing value. The testing method was selected based on the quality and type of sample obtained, prioritizing techniques proven effective for old or potentially degraded samples while ensuring the technology was appropriate for the time and legally recognized. Throughout testing, the laboratory maintained detailed technical records, including extraction methods, amplification steps, quality controls, and intermediate results, to ensure transparency and allow independent verification if required. Initial test results were analyzed to determine if the sample met quality standards for comparison. If not, the decision to proceed or halt was based on a cost-benefit assessment and the feasibility of additional collection. When the sample met standards, the obtained DNA data was compared to biological samples already retained in the case file, using appropriate statistical metrics to evaluate the degree of match. Comparison followed a two-step process. Preliminary results underwent internal review before independent confirmation to minimize errors or misinterpretation. When a potential match appeared, it was not treated as a final conclusion, but flagged as data requiring confirmation, accompanied by statistical parameters on probability and confidence interval. An independent laboratory or separate analysis team was used to reconfirm results, ensuring the match was not due to technical error or contamination. Upon confirmation of a match, a full technical report was prepared detailing the method, data, limitations, and scientific conclusions without exceeding the data obtained. This report was forwarded to the investigative team with guidance on its legal use, emphasizing that DNA is a strong indicator of biological relatedness, but does not automatically establish context or conduct. In the case file, the matching result was integrated into the existing data system, linked to the timeline and established information, allowing assessment of how the DNA data fit the overall case picture. The entire process of collection, sealing, testing, and match confirmation was documented as a continuous, traceable chain of actions to ensure the evidentiary value of the biological evidence was not diminished by procedural issues. At the conclusion of the DNA sample collection phase, the Robert Clay Whitfield case file gained not only a new scientific datum, but also a carefully constructed evidentiary foundation robust enough to withstand rigorous operational and legal scrutiny, while remaining within the limits of this phase. Recording and confirming biological match, without extending to motive interpretation or liability conclusions beyond permitted scope. Independent confirmation of the DNA match provided a sufficiently strong scientific reference axis for the investigative team to proceed to the next core phase, evidentiary consolidation in a legal direction, a process requiring absolute caution to ensure that all data collected over many years was not only operationally correct but also able to withstand prosecution standards. The initial focus of this phase was to synthesize all existing forensic results in the case file, including the original autopsy report, conclusions about the body's condition upon discovery, estimates of time of death, signs of external intervention, and biological analysis added through retesting. Rather than treating each report as isolated pieces of information, the team standardized the entire forensic data set into a unified structure, eliminating differences in terminology and presentation across time periods, to ensure conclusions could be read and understood under the same frame of reference. Any uncertainties in forensic conclusions, such as broad estimated time of death ranges or ambiguous injury causes, were preserved in the file with clearly noted confidence levels, avoiding any inadvertent sharpening of data beyond the actual scientific capability at the time. In parallel with forensic synthesis, a complete case timeline was reconstructed from scratch, integrating cleaned administrative data, witness statements, field search milestones, time of body discovery, and forensic results to create a seamless, traceable sequence of events. This timeline recorded not only confirmed events, but also information gaps and high uncertainty points, enabling file readers to distinguish clearly between solid data and speculative elements. Comparison of the timeline with DNA results was conducted cautiously, focusing on temporal and spatial compatibility between proven biological presence and documented events in the file, without extending interpretation to conduct or motive. If inconsistencies arose, such as a period suggested by DNA evidence not aligning with certain statements, the discrepancy was noted and analyzed as an issue requiring explanation, rather than removed or adjusted to fit assumptions. On the basis of the strengthened timeline, the team assessed prosecutability by reviewing all evidence against current legal criteria, including the legality of evidence collection, integrity of the chain of custody, scientific reliability of test results, and the degree of interconnection among evidence to form a coherent picture. Each evidence type was classified by legal value: direct, circumstantial, contextual support, and exculpatory, to avoid overweighting any single element. In particular, DNA evidence was evaluated in relation to other data, emphasizing that despite its high scientific value, it required placement within the overall context to avoid being viewed as a standalone, unconvincing piece of proof. Potentially contentious factors in prosecution, such as the age of the case, possible degradation of evidence over time, and changes in witness reliability over years, were clearly listed in the legal risk assessment section to allow prosecutors to prepare mitigation strategies in advance. When the evaluation indicated the case met the minimum threshold for prosecution consideration, the team proceeded to prepare the legal file with the goal of presenting the case in a clear, truthful, and verifiable manner. The file was structured logically, beginning with background on the disappearance, initial investigation developments, the stalled period, and transition to cold case status, re-investigation steps, and new scientific findings, each phase linked by specific documents and evidence. Every document in the file was numbered, with its origin, creation date, and relationship to other documents described to facilitate independent review and avoid inconsistencies. The legal summary section of the file did not assert guilt, but focused on presenting facts and evidence in a way that allowed readers to independently assess the reasonableness of proceeding to prosecution. At the same time, limitations of the file were clearly stated, including points that could not be further verified within the investigation's scope, to ensure transparency and avoid concealing weaknesses that could undermine the case later. Before finalization, the legal file underwent internal review by independent units within the investigative agency to verify completeness, consistency, and procedural compliance. All revisions were documented for traceability. At the conclusion of the evidentiary consolidation phase, the Robert Clay Whitfield case no longer existed as a scattered collection of old reports and new data, but was shaped into a complete legal file, in which forensic results, timeline, and legal evaluation were tightly interconnected, ready for the next step within the legal framework, without exceeding the limits of this phase: preparation and strengthening of the evidentiary foundation. The legal dossier has been finalized and internally reviewed, enabling the investigative team to proceed with the first coercive step in the multi-year process, applying for an arrest warrant based on the consolidated body of evidence meeting current legal standards. The warrant application was prepared as a standalone dossier, succinctly yet comprehensively summarizing the core elements, the sequence of events from Robert Clay Whitfield's disappearance to the discovery of his body, key forensic conclusions, independently verified DNA comparison results, a complete timeline demonstrating compatibility between biological evidence and case developments, and previously identified legal risk assessments. All details in the application were presented neutrally, avoiding speculation, and emphasized the legality of evidence collection procedures and the integrity of the chain of custody to meet the court's stringent review requirements. After the judge reviewed the dossier and determined that the probable cause threshold had been met, the arrest warrant was approved with specific provisions regarding scope, timing, and execution conditions, to minimize community risk and ensure the safety of participating personnel. The arrest operation plan was developed in detail, based on updated information about the suspect's residence, daily routines, and relevant security factors, prioritizing a controlled approach to avoid confrontation and minimize the possibility of unforeseen situations. Participating units were assigned clear roles: the direct approach team, support team, documentation and video recording team, and the team responsible for handling any potential evidence at the scene. The execution timing was selected based on risk analysis and the suspect's likely presence to ensure the warrant was carried out swiftly and within legal bounds. Upon the team's arrival at the location, the procedure was executed exactly as approved, the suspect's identity was confirmed, the arrest warrant was announced, and rights were explained per legal requirements before any restraint was applied. The suspect was controlled calmly and systematically, ensuring safety for all parties involved while avoiding any actions that could later lead to disputes over the legality of the arrest. Immediately after the suspect was secured, scene preservation was implemented at a level appropriate to the warrant's scope, neither arbitrarily expanded nor insufficient to protect items directly relevant to the case. All actions were documented via photographs and written records to create a transparent record of the entire execution process. Concurrently with securing the suspect, the Supplemental Evidence Collection Team conducted a targeted search of areas and items, explicitly listed in the warrant, focusing on elements that could supplement or reinforce the existing chain of evidence, rather than conducting a broad sweep. Seized items were handled according to procedure. Each item was documented in detail regarding location, condition, time of seizure, and responsible personnel, then sealed and entered into the official chain of custody. In particular, potential biological evidence was handled with extreme care, using specialized tools to prevent cross-contamination and ensure that any future testing value would not be compromised. Throughout the process, the suspect was continuously monitored to ensure legal rights were respected, and all interactions were fully documented to prevent future disputes. Once the arrest and evidence collection were complete, the suspect was removed from the scene via the pre-planned route, while the scene was handed back according to procedure, retaining only areas necessary for additional documentation. All participating personnel conducted a rapid debrief to review executed steps, compare them against the original plan, and record any deviations or incidents, no matter how minor, to ensure the execution record accurately reflected what occurred. Seized evidence was transferred to the storage division, according to the established chain of custody, accompanied by a detailed transfer protocol to maintain traceability. The arrest report was prepared the same day, clearly stating the legal basis, execution details, the suspect's condition upon arrest, the inventory of seized items, and any noteworthy security or procedural factors. The report contained no opinions or conclusions beyond its scope, focusing solely on accurate and complete factual recording. At the conclusion of the arrest phase, the Robert Clay Whitfield case officially transitioned from investigation to prosecution status, with the suspect now under legal control and supplemental evidence properly collected, marking a pivotal milestone in the multi-year process, without revealing or foreshadowing subsequent legal developments beyond this step. With the suspect now lawfully under the control of authorities, a fundamentally different phase of investigation began, one focused not on identifying or locating a subject, but on verifying, strengthening, and completing the evidentiary picture through interrogation and analysis of statements, in close correlation with previously collected data. The interrogation process was meticulously prepared in advance, both procedurally and strategically, ensuring strict compliance with the suspect's rights while creating conditions to legally and effectively elicit probative information. The suspect's personal file, including background history, life milestones, communication habits, and data established during prior investigation, was used as the foundation for a layered interrogation plan, avoiding random or redundant questioning. Interrogation sessions were conducted separately, each with a clear objective, fully audio and video recorded, and attended by required parties to ensure transparency and legal admissibility. During questioning, investigators maintained a neutral approach, allowing the suspect to present events from their own perspective, thereby observing the structure of the narrative, consistency, and handling of specific details when clarification was requested. No coercion or leading was employed. All questions were grounded in existing evidence, progressing from general to specific to assess alignment between statements and the factual record. When the suspect provided information on timelines, locations, or relationships, it was recorded precisely without immediate comment, to be used in post-interrogation analysis. Parallel to statement collection, the investigative team systematically analyzed content, strictly separating recording from evaluation to avoid subjective interpretation. Each statement was transcribed, then coded by established case themes, such as timelines, movements, personal contacts, awareness of key events, and reactions to presented facts. Analysis focused not only on what was said, but also on omissions, evasions, levels of detail, and changes in expression across sessions. Minor discrepancies were categorized by degree, from those explainable by psychological or memory factors to functional contradictions, potentially impacting the case structure. All points were recorded objectively, without labeling or speculating about motive. The next step was comparing statements against the entire consolidated evidence system, requiring close coordination among specialized teams. Timelines provided by the suspect were plotted on the complete case timeline to check compatibility or discrepancies, while descriptions of locations and actions were cross-referenced with scene data, forensic results, and physical evidence. Statements concerning personal contacts or presence at specific locations were directly compared with DNA and other biological data to evaluate whether the suspect's explanations aligned with scientific evidence. When mismatches arose, the team did not rush to conclusions but documented the incompatibility as an issue requiring further clarification, possibly through additional interrogation or data re-examination. Evidence seized during the arrest was subjected to parallel comparison to identify specific connections to statements, such as origin, usage timing, and relevance to documented events. Throughout this phase, the core principle was that no single evidence type should dominate the evaluation. Statements were assessed in relation to physical evidence, scientific evidence, and administrative data, creating a cross-verification network to minimize error. When comparison showed high alignment between certain statements and evidence, those portions were flagged as supportive data, while misalignments were analyzed further to determine causes, such as memory error, deliberate concealment, or contextual misunderstanding. All evaluations were documented in writing, with specific references to source materials or evidence, ensuring conclusions were not based on individual investigators' subjective impressions. Upon completion of interrogation rounds and analysis, the case file moved into final preparation for prosecution, integrating the suspect's statements into the pre-existing structure. Documents were reorganized to reflect the logical sequence of events, from initial disappearance, prolonged investigation, new findings, to post-arrest data, with each section linked by specific evidence. The interrogation portion was presented transparently, including context, content, consistencies and contradictions, and assessment of alignment with other evidence, without making guilt determinations. Concurrently, the investigative team re-reviewed the entire file to confirm all evidence had a legal origin, complete chain of custody, and no procedural violations that could undermine prosecution. Potential weaknesses such as unexplained contradictions or unfillable information gaps within the investigation scope were clearly noted in internal memos for realistic prosecutorial risk assessment. At the conclusion of the post-arrest investigation phase, the Robert Clay Whitfield case was transferred to prosecution-ready status with a structurally and substantively complete dossier, in which the suspect's statements were properly positioned as one element requiring verification within the overall evidence framework, not the sole centerpiece, ensuring all subsequent steps rested on a foundation of carefully processed data and strict adherence to this phase's limits. The completed prosecution dossier was transferred to the trial phase, where the multi-year investigative process underwent formal judicial scrutiny, beginning with the presentation of the indictment, based on systematically consolidated evidence. The prosecutor representing the state introduced the case according to a pre-prepared logical structure, clearly identifying the defendant, the legal nature of the charged conduct, and the timeline related to Robert Clay Whitfield's disappearance and death, while clarifying that this was the outcome of a prolonged investigation spanning multiple stages: initial missing person file, criminal case cold case status, and re-investigation. The indictment focused not on emotional interpretation or motive, but on presenting the sequence of events and evidence per legal standards, emphasizing the interconnections among forensic data, DNA analysis results, physical evidence, and established timelines. After the indictment was read, the court moved to evidence presentation, with each evidence category introduced sequentially to ensure coherence and verifiability. Forensic reports were presented first to establish the scientific foundation, including conclusions about the body's condition, signs of external intervention, and limitations in determining cause of death, all explained within the scientific knowledge framework at the time of collection. Next came physical and biological evidence, with DNA comparison results central but not standalone, placed in context with chain of custody records, sample collection protocols, sealing procedures, and testing, to demonstrate legality and reliability. Investigative documents, including the complete case timeline and statement comparison charts, were used to illustrate how individual pieces of evidence connected, providing the jury with an overall view of the case progression. The defense had the opportunity to review and challenge each evidence category, focusing on potentially contentious points such as the age of evidence, degradation risks for biological samples over time, and information gaps from the initial investigation. Evidence review proceeded under adversarial principles, with each side presenting arguments based on the same dataset, and the court acting as impartial arbiter, assessing the persuasiveness and appropriateness of those arguments. Once all evidence had been presented and reviewed, the court entered deliberation to render a verdict, a step marking comprehensive consideration of the indictment, evidence, and legal arguments from both sides. The verdict was not based on any single factor, but on a holistic evaluation of each evidence category's probative strength and mutual support in establishing legal truth. The jury assessed whether the chain of evidence was sufficient to meet the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, while weighing the limitations and weaknesses raised during trial. Upon announcement of the verdict, the court determined the defendant's criminal responsibility for the charges presented based on that evaluation, creating an official legal resolution for a case spanning decades. Following the verdict, the court proceeded to sentencing according to the applicable penalty framework, considering statutory aggravating and mitigating factors, including the severity of the conduct, the prolonged impact of the case, and factors related to the defendant's background. Sentencing was conducted publicly, and in accordance with procedure, with clear explanation of the legal basis for the imposed sentence to ensure transparency and comprehensibility of the judicial decision. Sentencing was not merely a procedural conclusion to the trial phase, but also a milestone marking the justice system's formal response to a long-dormant case, closing the evidence review and adversarial process within the courtroom and completing this phase's role without extending to broader social consequences or external impacts beyond the trial's scope. With the sentence pronounced and core procedural steps completed, the case officially entered the closure phase, a phase that, far from being merely formal, required comprehensive review to ensure the entire investigation, prosecution and trial process was properly concluded and suitable for long-term archival. Case closure began with a final inventory of all documents related to the Robert Clay Whitfield case, including the initial missing person administrative file, search reports, forensic reports, scene investigation documents, cold case file, supplemental test results, prosecution materials, court records, and final judicial decisions. Each document was cross-checked against the original inventory to ensure completeness and categorized by function and period, to create a logical archival structure facilitating future transparent retrieval or review. Remaining evidence in the chain of custody was reviewed for legal status, determining which items required continued retention per regulation, which could be destroyed or returned, with all decisions documented clearly to prevent future disputes. Parallel to physical and documentary closure, the investigative agency conducted a mandatory operational review, not to identify individual misconduct, but to draw systemic lessons from a decades-long case. The review examined the entire process from initial missing person report intake, initial classification, search methods, scene processing, evidence collection and preservation, to operational decisions that led to cold case status. Strengths such as evidence preservation sufficient for retesting after many years were recorded as positive factors, while limitations, including lack of appropriate scientific tools at the outset, limited resources, or defensive operational decisions were analyzed in historical context to avoid biased judgment. The review also clarified reasons for the case's prolonged duration without progress, distinguishing objective from subjective factors. Objective factors included early-era forensic technology limitations, especially rudimentary DNA analysis capabilities, absence of comparison databases, and inability to effectively exploit certain biological traces at the time. Resource-related factors, such as heavy caseloads, prioritization of new cases, and generational turnover of investigators, were also noted as contributors to delays. Subjective factors, such as certain investigative leads not pursued to completion due to insufficient supporting evidence, or critical timelines left blank due to incomplete information, were analyzed to illustrate how such gaps accumulated over time. Identifying these causes was not about retroactive blame, but about creating an honest picture of how a case could gradually slip from investigative priority under real-world justice system conditions. Upon completion of the operational review, conclusions and recommendations were recorded in an internal report, emphasizing improvements implemented during re-investigation, particularly the adoption of contemporary scientific tools, standardization of files, and cleansing of statement data, as key factors enabling ultimate resolution. This report became part of the archival file, intended not for public release, but for future training and professional reference. The final step of the closure phase was updating the case status in the management system from cold case to resolved, an administrative action with symbolic significance for the multi-year process. Closure was not recorded as a sudden event, but as the cumulative result of sequential actions, each contributing its role, even when outcomes were not immediately apparent. The case file was sealed per archival regulations, with specific provisions governing future access for legal, research, or review purposes upon proper request. With the closure process complete, the Robert Clay Whitfield case officially left open status, no longer an unanswered question in the system, but a complete file reflecting the full journey from disappearance, investigation, impasse, re-investigation, to final resolution. Closing the file does not erase lost time or irreversible consequences, but marks the point at which the justice system exhausted its capabilities within the constraints of each era, concluding a decades-long cold case with a clear legal resolution and a long-term archival dossier. The story of Robert Clay Whitfield is not just a closed file but a very real mirror of how tragedy can occur amid ordinary American life, and how we can reduce risks, increase chances of being found, or at least help the truth emerge faster. Robert vanished on a day, nothing unusual, only off rhythm in that he didn't return on time. Family searched the neighborhood themselves before calling police, and only then was it classified as missing person per procedure. The first lesson in modern American life: don't wait overnight to act. Establish a clear family alert threshold, for example, unreachable for X hours, call relatives, Y hours, call police, especially for those with stable routines like Robert. Second, the case dragged on for years due to lack of new data, but was ultimately reopened, thanks to preserved evidence and DNA technology enabling comparison, reminding every family to standardize identification information, updated photos, descriptive features, contact lists, routine routes, and especially critical medical identification data, health conditions, medications. Third, the re-investigation succeeded by cleaning old statements, cross-referencing timelines, collecting indirect DNA samples, and maintaining tight chain of custody seals, meaning when working with authorities, you should document every call time and responsible person, and preserve all related items' notes in their original state, rather than rearranging out of anxiety. Finally, this story shows justice can arrive very late, but family preparation, disciplined communication, clear personal records, early and correct response, and proper cooperation can significantly shorten that path in today's American life. If you're interested in cases that seemed buried by time but were ultimately brought to light, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss authentic, haunting investigative stories like Robert Clay Whitfield's. Thank you for watching until the very end, and see you in the next video, where we continue following old trails to uncover truths never before told.